Who gets to be called a terrorist? Western state violence, Muslim civilian deaths, and the architecture of moral immunity ***. Abstract. Over the past 3 decades, United States-led military interventions have resulted in extensive civilian casualties, disproportionately affecting Muslim-majority societies. Despite the scale, predictability, and documentation of civilian harm, Western political leaders responsible for these policies, most notably under the administrations of Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, have never been labeled terrorists nor subjected to comparable moral or legal scrutiny. This essay interrogates the political construction of the term terrorism, examining how power, race, religion, and geopolitical dominance shape who is condemned and who is exempt. Drawing on international law, casualty studies, critical security studies, and post-colonial theory, the paper argues that the refusal to apply the label terrorism to state violence constitutes a systemic double standard that undermines the universality of human rights and erodes the credibility of international law. The essay concludes that selective moral accounting is not an analytical error, but an institutionalized feature of global power. 1. Introduction: The politics of naming violence. Violence does not speak for itself. It is named, framed, justified, condemned, or normalized through language. In contemporary global discourse, few terms carry as much moral weight as terrorism. To be labeled a terrorist is to be placed outside the boundaries of legitimate political action, stripped of moral credibility, and rendered subject to extraordinary measures, including indefinite detention, extrajudicial killing, and collective punishment. Yet terrorism is not applied symmetrically. Over the last 30 years, U.S.-led wars and interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Libya, Syria, and elsewhere have caused millions of deaths, the majority civilians, overwhelmingly in Muslim-majority societies. These deaths were not unforeseeable accidents. They were repeatedly predicted by humanitarian organizations, acknowledged internally by policymakers, and documented by independent researchers. And still, the architects of these policies, presidents, defense secretaries, intelligence chiefs, are described not as terrorists but as leaders, decision-makers, or at worst, flawed strategists. This essay asks a simple but destabilizing question. Why does large-scale, foreseeable civilian killing by powerful states escape the moral and linguistic category of terrorism, while far smaller-scale violence by non-state Muslim actors is immediately defined by it? 2. Defining terrorism. Law, ambiguity, and power 2.1 The elusive definition. There is no single, universally accepted legal definition of terrorism. However, most scholarly and legal frameworks converge around several core elements. Use or threat of violence. Targeting of civilians or non-combatants. Intent to achieve political, ideological, or strategic goals. Creation of fear beyond the immediate victims. These elements appear in United Nations debates, academic literature, and domestic legal systems. Critically, nothing in these criteria inherently excludes states. 2.2 The state exception. Despite this, most official definitions implicitly or explicitly exclude state actors. This exclusion is not accidental. It reflects a post-World War II international order designed by states to regulate non-state violence while preserving state monopoly on legitimate force. Thus, when states kill civilians, it is framed as collateral damage, unintended consequences, operational necessity. When non-state actors kill civilians, it is framed as terror, barbarism, evil. The distinction is linguistic, not ethical. 3. Clinton era, sanctions, bombings, and structural violence 3.1 Iraq sanctions as mass harm policy. Throughout the 1990s, Iraq was subjected to one of the most comprehensive sanctions regimes in modern history. These sanctions severely restricted imports of food, medicine, water purification equipment, and medical supplies. Multiple UN agencies reported catastrophic humanitarian consequences, including widespread malnutrition, collapse of healthcare infrastructure, massive child mortality from preventable diseases. The sanctions were not an unintended byproduct. They were a deliberate policy instrument. U.S. officials were repeatedly warned of the civilian toll. When asked whether the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children were worth it, senior officials responded affirmatively. If a non-state actor knowingly imposed conditions leading to mass civilian death to achieve political aims, the label terrorism would be immediate. But Clinton's administration was never framed this way. 3.2 bombing campaigns, and limited strikes. The Clinton administration also conducted repeated bombing campaigns against Iraq, Sudan, and the former Yugoslavia. These operations were framed as humanitarian or preventive, even when civilian infrastructure was hit. Civilian casualties were acknowledged, then quickly displaced from discourse. The moral framework remained intact. State violence was legitimate by definition. 4. George W. Bush, Preventive War and the Architecture of Deception. 4.1 Iraq 2003. A war built on falsehoods. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 represents one of the most consequential acts of state violence in recent history. The justification, possession of weapons of mass destruction, was later shown to be false. This was not a minor intelligence error. It was a systemic failure involving selective intelligence, political pressure, and deliberate exaggeration. 4.2 Civilian deaths and state collapse. Independent casualty studies estimate hundreds of thousands to over 1 million deaths as a result of the Iraq War and its aftermath. The majority were civilians. Beyond deaths the war caused: state collapse, sectarian violence, forced displacement of millions, rise of extremist organizations. These outcomes were widely predicted by experts prior to the invasion. Foreseeability matters. In moral philosophy and international law, knowingly causing foreseeable civilian harm constitutes responsibility. Yet Bush was never labeled a terrorist. Instead, the narrative shifted to good intentions, poor execution, lessons learned. This reframing insulated power from moral condemnation. 5. Afghanistan, the longest war, the quietest deaths. The U.S. war in Afghanistan lasted over 20 years. Civilian deaths accumulated gradually, often outside the Western media spotlight. Airstrikes, night raids, detention abuses, and support for warlords produced sustained civilian harm. When the war ended, the Taliban returned to power, and Afghanistan was left economically devastated. No U.S. leader was held criminally accountable. Duration did not translate into scrutiny. 6. Obama and the normalization of remote killing. 6.1 Drones and distance. The Obama administration transformed drone warfare into a central counterterrorism tool. Targeted killings were conducted across multiple countries, often without host state consent. Key features: secret legal memos. Kill list redefinition of combatant, posthumous classification of victims. 6.2 The moral alchemy of precision. Drones were marketed as humane and precise. Yet civilian casualties persisted, particularly when strikes targeted gatherings or relied on pattern-of-life analysis. Obama's administration counted military-aged males as combatants unless proven otherwise, a presumption incompatible with international humanitarian law. Distance sanitized violence. The farther the operator, the easier the moral abstraction. 7. Muslim deaths and the racialization of victimhood. 7.1 Whose lives count? Western casualties are individualized. Muslim casualties are aggregated. Names versus numbers. Faces versus statistics. This disparity is not incidental. It reflects a deeper racial and civilizational hierarchy in global media and politics. 7.2 Islamophobia as structural context. The framing of Muslim societies as inherently violent, unstable, or backward enables the normalization of their suffering. Civilian deaths become tragic but inevitable. This dehumanization is a prerequisite for moral immunity. 8. International law and selective enforcement. 8.1 The ICC and power asymmetry. International criminal law is theoretically universal. In practice, it is selective. Non-Western leaders are prosecuted. Western leaders are not. The U.S. has actively opposed the International Criminal Court when it threatens American personnel. Impunity is institutionalized. 8.2 The collapse of credibility. When law is applied selectively, it ceases to function as law and becomes an instrument of power. This erosion fuels cynicism, resentment, and instability. 9. Terrorism as a moral boundary, not a legal one. The refusal to label Western leaders as terrorists is not about evidence. It is about identity and authority. Terrorism is not defined by what one does, but by who one is allowed to be. This boundary preserves Western moral superiority, strategic legitimacy, historical amnesia. 10. Consequences. Violence begets violence. Extremist groups do not emerge in a vacuum. They emerge in contexts of occupation, humiliation, unaddressed civilian death. This does not justify their actions, but it explains their persistence. Ignoring state violence while condemning non-state violence is not counterterrorism. It is cycle maintenance. 11. Conclusion, toward moral consistency. This essay does not argue that Western leaders and non-state militants are identical. It argues that civilian life must be valued consistently, regardless of who pulls the trigger or orders the strike. If terrorism is violence against civilians for political ends, then state violence must be subject to the same moral scrutiny. Until that happens, human rights discourse will remain hollow, international law will remain selective, and the dead will remain unequally mourned. Justice cannot be conditional. Language cannot be owned by power. And civilian lives cannot be ranked by geography or faith.